If you look at this side, it looks pretty normal, but if you look at this side, it looks like pretty wonky. And this is what we call wonky comb. You can see here it's kind of just built away from the frame and perpendicular to it. Hey everybody, David Burns, good to be with you today. Thanks for joining me on my channel today. Hope you learned a lot about beekeeping. We're going to talk about different frames, how to avoid crazy stuff like this from happening, and maybe what frames aren't the best to use and what steps you can take even when things are working against you to help this not to happen. So if we look at this frame here, it's really interesting. You can tell the bees have actually built out the comb, not even attaching it to the lower half of this frame. And that's what you see sometimes, particularly when you're using some plastic foundation. We'll talk more about that and how to avoid it in just a minute. And one of the things that's noteworthy is see how all these cells are worker size cell, even here, but the bump out, this area here, larger size drone cell. You see the difference? Worker size cell, drone cell. So they drew this out and made it larger for the drones than they did the workers above it. See how big this is for drone brood? It looks like bees got off to a good start on the top half, but on the bottom half, they just got off of the foundation and did not attach their comb to the foundation. And look, here's a queen cell right here. Looks like there was one over here as well. And oftentimes you'll find queen cells in areas of unevenness on the comb itself. It gives the bees the ability to start raising queens in that location. And these are supersedure cells usually when you see them like this. This side over here, this is a good frame to use again this next bee season. They may draw this rest of this part out a little bit more. But over here, I plan to shave off this comb and use it somewhere else and see if I can coat this with a little more wax. Now, I've made a lot of videos about adding wax to frames, and I can tell this was one that I probably didn't add any extra wax to. Usually they come from the manufacturer with wax on them, but I never feel like that's enough wax. I've made a lot of videos, particularly made one about a few months ago, where we added more wax to a plastic foundation like this on a honey super frame, and we compared it to one that did not have more wax added to it, and boy was there a big difference when you add wax to it. Now let me talk about some of these frames. We'll get back to this one and talk a little bit more, but I want to talk a little bit about different kind of frames. When I first started beekeeping, a particular frame that we used was a wax foundation frame. And as you can see here in this video, here's an example of wax foundation. And that's all we had when I started. There wasn't any plastic frames foundation back then. And so we would actually have to take sheets of wax foundation and then we would add wire to help hold them in place on hot days, pins and wires, crimped wires into the foundation to make it all solid. And I would literally spend my whole winter just working on my frames, tearing out old bad foundation and pulling out the wax and then cleaning out the wax grooves and all that and scraping it all off and rewiring it for the next year, adding more foundation. We would literally get boxes of sheets of foundation, and some people still use that. It's still available. It's just a little bit more work, but it's wax, thin wax foundation. And then along came plastic. And so here's a good example of a plastic frame today that a lot of beekeepers get started with. Plastic foundation with a wood frame. Now this is called a frame for those of you new to beekeeping. And just to give you a kind of an anatomy of a frame, this is the top bar, these are the side bar, and these are the bottom bars. That's what we refer to a frame. The sheet in the middle here is a hard food grade quality plastic. Again, it comes from the manufacturer with a little bit of beeswax on it to give the bees a head start, but I don't think is enough. And then it just pops in here. Now, you can buy this already assembled or you can buy it unassembled. That means you can build your own, put all the pieces together, the wooden pieces, and then snap in your foundation. The foundation just fits into a groove at the top and a groove at the bottom, and it kind of has a little bit of play in there. And this is typically what a lot of beekeepers are using now, just because it's easy to use. Now, when I first started, like I said, I was a wax foundation guy because that's all there was. But when these started coming around, they weren't as good as what we have today. It took a while. We had different types of thinner pieces of plastic called Duragilt, and a lot of experimentation with different companies trying different stuff. And it just didn't seem to work as well. But today, these are pretty nice, pretty nice frames actually. I enjoy using a wooden frame with a plastic foundation. Now you can go all the way plastic, as you see in this frame here. Now this is a deep frame, and it's made with plastic. One piece is plastic sidebars, top bar, and bottom board. And so these became very popular for a while, but I think with the introduction and the rapid increase in small hive beetle, these aren't so loved anymore, because if you look particularly in the sidebars, I guess they have to manufacture it this way. There is a lot of grooved area, and boy, do beetles hide out in these little tight grooves all along the bottom board as well, and the top bar. There's just groove after groove for small hive beetle to take shelter in away from the bees. And you don't get that so much with a wooden frame. So these are, that's one of the downside of the plastic, all plastic frames. Some people say you should never mix a plastic frame with a wooden frame or a wax frame. But I have done that and have not seen any problems at all. A lot of my hives, and you can see my videos where I'll have plastic foundation along with wooden frames, and side by side, all plastic, all wood, and they work just fine. Now, particularly, look at this one. Before I tell you about this green comb, let me tell you to please subscribe. Bobblehead David is on duty today, encouraging you guys to please subscribe. It means a lot to me when you subscribe to my channel. Hoping to grow my channel little by little with your help. So hit that subscribe button. I appreciate it. This is a drone frame for capturing the Varroa destructor mite. It is a drone brood frame. It's green so the beekeeper can quickly identify it when you open up your hive. But when we use these, the cells are larger, and that causes the queen, who measures the cell size with her two front legs, to actually not fertilize the egg, and so it becomes a male drone. And the Varroa mite prefers to go into cells that are male drones, and that way you can actually wait until it's almost capped over all the way, pull it out, freeze it, and you can kill all your mites in the freezer. So this is a good way to practice integrated pest management to control the Varroa destructor without the use of different treatments and chemicals by using this. Yeah, you destroy your drones that are maturing on these frames, but most of us feel like it's a small sacrifice to make in order to control the Varroa destructor from killing your entire hive, because bees will quickly raise more drones as they need them. But that's a green drone comb, very useful for mite control as well. And then finally, this is an example of what it looks like once this frame, that is a wood frame with foundation, is fully drawn out, nicely drawn out. And you can see here that there are little pieces of connective comb. And sometimes bees will connect one frame to the other. These are just a little tight, little slight examples. It's nothing to be alarmed about. And on this side, you don't see that. You'll see things at the top where there's usually a little bit too much space at the top. There's oftentimes maybe the inner cover or the top cover has a gap. And wherever there's a gap that's beyond bee space, you're going to see, if it's bigger than bee space, you're going to see comb being built there. Some connective comb, burr comb we call it. And then of course, where it's really small, much smaller than bee space, you'll see, like we see here on the sidebars, this is propolis. Bees will use propolis to kind of glue all their parts together. And don't just think of propolis as glue, because it has a lot of medicinal purposes for the bee. It's antimicrobial for the bees as part of their immune system, that it can kill a lot of pathogens as well. So it has a lot of properties to it that bees can use. They coat the inside of their hive like if they're in a big tree or something, and that keeps the tree from decomposing and shedding off a lot of bad things inside the hive. So they just coat the inside of a tree to protect themselves from that. Bees also will use propolis. They'll propolize things that they can't take out of a hive. For example, there's pictures of mice that have gotten into bee hives that bees could not take out of the hive. So the bees just killed the mouse and then they coated it with propolis. And so that as it decomposes, it just won't give off a lot of bad stuff and make the bees sick. So this is a frame, a good example of clumps of propolis that show up around different parts of the hive, different parts of the frame. And so in the wintertime, if you have time on your hands, you can always spend a little bit of time cleaning all this off. Now let's get back to the frame at hand that we looked at that was kind of, had a lot of wonky comb on it. And I remember working the hive that had this on it. And it was not bad, but what happens sometimes is that the frame next to it is going to be wonky as well, because you can see initially they started out good right here, but as they build it further lower on the bottom of the frame, they actually built it away from the foundation. What that means, this part here is out more. That being out is going to cause the next frame not to be able to be nicely built like this side is. So if another frame is up against this, the spacing is wrong for the next frame to be built correctly. And so what's a beekeeper to do? Well, if you can have enough time to go in there and watch and kind of observe your bees pulling out new foundation, you can correct it before it gets this bad. So in other words, you can watch bees drawing out a new frame of foundation. And if you start to see they're building out columns or building it away from the foundation, then what you need to do is see if you can take that off. And maybe there's not any brood on it yet or any honey or resources, take it inside your shop and add more wax to it, melt some wax, and then brush it on the area where they haven't drawn it out yet, where they're kind of doing it away from the foundation. But you can get ahead of the game, as you can see here in this video, where I show you how just to take a brush, melt down some wax, and give a good thick layer of wax on all your new foundation. And that's certainly what I'll need to do here on this frame. As you can see, a little bit of wax is on there. You can kind of feel it, but it's not going to be enough to prevent something like this from happening. So I have found in my personal experience that adding an abundance of wax to a plastic sheet like this is going to prevent the bees from building out some wonky comb like this. Now, I have had some frames like this that have sat around, like maybe I bought a whole bunch, I didn't use them in a year or two, and they sat out in a workshop or a building somewhere, and they kind of got older, and it seems like some of that wax just, I don't know, it kind of goes away. And if you don't use it right away, then it seems like it's going to really be a bigger problem. The more, if you leave these out in the weather, for example, and that wax that's on there now either gets kind of melted off with the weather or the rains or the hot sun or something freezing, it's just going to be potentially a frame like this where there's a lot of wonky comb being done to it. So if you've ever experienced some of the columns that bees have built, or some of the way that bees will build actual comb away from the foundation, off of it, and then straight down, that's usually because there's not enough wax on those frames, or you may not have the frames pushed tightly together. One more thing I want to talk about, and I don't know why this has been such a, no one's ever mentioned this. I've heard very little bit about this, but when I first started beekeeping, we were using the same kind of frames. They were wooden frames like this, although it was wax foundation. But the sidebars were very unique when I first started beekeeping, and it was a standard of frames, and that was that these sidebars, they were flat on one side and they were pointed on the other side. Now, you rarely see that anymore. I do notice that in the Apiary hive, their frames still respect a flat side of a sidebar and a pointed side on the other. Now, what's the purpose of one side being pointed? The reason that they were made that way back in the day is because bees will propolize these frames together. So this frame here would be up against the sidebars. That's what creates a better space for them, the equal out bee space. And as you can see, when these two sidebars touch, one would be flat, but the other one touching it would have a point to it. That point allowed the beekeeper to quickly separate frames because two flat pieces weren't glued together. It was a flat piece and a pointed piece touching it. And you could easily get your hive tool in there. You could easily separate frames. Now, for some reason, without even asking us, apparently, asking for our opinion, the frames come with flat pieces on both sides. I stand corrected if you can let me know there's a company that still makes wooden frames with a point on one side. I prefer the pointed side, as you can tell. That's still a hot issue for me. I really liked it with one side pointed, but just not seeing that anymore. Now, how old are you willing to let your comb get before you replace it? All comb is going to start off very light. When bees make the wax from their wax glands between the ages of 12 to 17 days old, they have 4 wax glands on each side of underneath their abdomen, and they actually secrete this liquid wax that gets hard, and then they have wax pellets that they make wax for. They don't gather wax from other places. They make it by consuming nectar, activating their wax glands at that certain age. And then they take the wax and work it with their mouth parts, their mandibles and legs and all. They just build, they're engineers. They build these frames like this out of their own wax they manufacture. And so the wax starts out really pretty. It's white, very bright color. Sometimes it's quickly stained or kind of colored by the pollen that may be being brought in and tracked around in the hive. I've seen it where in the spring you can have a lot of yellow, new wax that's yellow just from the bees collecting so much dandelion pollen and bringing it back into the hive. Nonetheless, the question remains, what do we do with wax that gets really old? And how do you know it's too old? How old is old? You know, the best way to keep track of your frames, I believe, is to actually date them. You can take a piece of shipping tape that's got the string in it and put a piece of tape across here. That way you can take it off when you don't want it anymore. But you can date it, write it with a magic marker, and put the date on top of the frames when you put them into the hive. And most of us feel like you never want to go beyond 10 years. The reason that is, not so much in the honey super frames, but the reason is in more like these deep frames that are in the brood area. These frames are going to be used by the bees to raise brood, and every time there's a generation of bees being produced, there's going to be a cocoon in every cell. And another cocoon in 21 days, another cocoon in the next 21 days, and you can see after weeks, months, and years, those cocoons are going to start making these cells very, very small, even round instead of a hexagon cell. And they're going to darken with age. Now, we also fear there can be more problems. 2 problems that we need to think about. Probably the number 1 problem that a lot of beekeepers don't realize is this comb is constantly collecting chemicals. Studies, I know this is weird, but studies have been shown by Jennifer Berry at, the Georgia University. She showed that a lot of the hives that she was testing showed evidence of chemicals. A lot of them were beekeeping chemicals like coumaphos, fluvovinate, that were on these frames, even though the beekeeper never put those chemicals in their hive. In other words, if you let the bees build out their own wax and you're chemical free, that chemical somehow gets picked up by bees, maybe robbing other hives or something, and it gets into these frames. So this comb does have the potential to collect different types of chemicals, and it's being collected in the brood area, the incubator, so to speak. And so that's why it's sort of disconcerting to think about that there are chemicals in our comb that can hurt our brood that's being raised, and that's going to be compounded. Some of these chemicals just don't go away. And even some of the chemicals that beekeepers use, some of it goes away pretty quickly, depending on what it is. But nonetheless, changing out the frames, the comb especially, is going to be real beneficial to get rid of any nasties that are actually in the wax. Now, the second thing is diseases. You have the concern of American foul brood being left between the cocoons, little spores being left between the cocoons of each cell. So you got European foul brood, you got American foul brood, you got different brood diseases that may continue to live on in these frames, even if they're not in use anymore. The spores can still remain in there, stored in barns and places, and become active again once the beekeeper uses them in 20 or 30 years, believe it or not. So old comb isn't a good thing. And again, I think most of us feel like we go by the year. I would say if you change out 3 or 4 of your frames after about 5 years, you'll start a system where you're replacing 3 to 4 or 5 frames every year, introducing new ones. You never have to think about it. But if you're one not to do that, you're going to have to keep track so you don't have old frames past 10 years old. The comb is what's bad. Now, what you can do if you don't want to buy brand new frames, that you could just simply pop out this sheet. I'll do that now. This is harder in a little medium super, but you can pop this out with the comb on it and put a new sheet in, wax it. The frames are safe to, use forever. So that's a handy way to do that if you want to change out some of these combs. I could pop this out, put a new sheet in there, but I don't want to do it because I got 2 new of wax on this side, and I can just add some more wax once I tear this piece out. Now, if you think you could benefit from taking my online beekeeping courses, you are correct. It will help you so much. They're 50% off during Black Friday all the way through Cyber Monday. Here's a link right here. I hope you take advantage of it, because the more educated we are as beekeepers, the better we're going to do at keeping our bees healthier and make fewer mistakes. If you're new to the whole thing of beekeeping and you're thinking about starting in the spring, I've made a video for you how to start beekeeping. It's right here. I'll see you guys over there.